Hello, everyone. This is Kristen Huber, and on behalf of NetSfere and 451 Research, which is now part of S&P Global Market Intelligence, I'd like to welcome you and say thank you for attending today's webcast titled Enabling a Distributed Workforce with Secure Encrypted Communications. Leading off today's discussion will be Raul Castanon-Martin, who is Senior Analyst at 451 Research. Joining Raul will be Anurag, who is President and CEO of NetSfere. Feel free to learn more about Raul and Anurag from their bio section on your screen. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A session. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section in the console. And finally, the on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly after the live event concludes. And with that, I'll turn it over to Raul.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Let me just quickly go over the agenda and the different topics that we want to cover today. We will center the discussion on the role that secure encrypted communications play for enabling a distributed workforce. This is a topic that has been top of mind this year. And it is also a topic that we have been looking at for a little while, so we want to share our experience with you and how we see this influencing the evolution of enterprise communications. So for this purpose, we want to share with you key data points from several Voice of the Enterprise surveys. They include our macroeconomic outlook, corporate IT spending. We also have our Information Security Organizational Dynamics survey. And finally, the Digital Pulse Coronavirus Flash survey. This last one is a survey that we have done right now over 3 waves. The latest one was in October, and there has been a very interesting evolution in terms of the initial response to where we are right now with organizations looking more towards the longer term and the implications this has for enterprise communications tools. And with this, the growing interest in secure encrypted communications. So with these data points, what we want to do is look at the impact of the pandemic on team collaboration. We all know that many of us are now working remotely, and this really changes drastically how organizations are managing their team collaboration and communications. So we want to highlight some of the key influences there. We also want to look at the challenges that all of these represents, including security. And we want to talk a little bit about encryption. Should encryption be a standard feature for enterprise collaboration? Which use cases should have mandatory encryption, and what the experience has been so far with other organizations that have started on this journey. And we want to frame this within the conversation of what we call Agile Collaboration. This is another trend that we have been following for several years, and we are seeing that it has become more and more relevant post-pandemic. So as Kristen mentioned, joining us today is Anurag. He is the CEO of NetSfere, and he will share his experience helping support organizations enable secure encrypted communications. So with this, let's get started. And what I could like to do first, I don't see the advancing, Kristen. Okay, there it is. Sorry about that. So what I would like to start with is just basically present a picture of what the current state of the work environment looks like. These are numbers that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, since we have been living with this for nearly 9 months now. The numbers that you see on the screen are key data points from our Digital Pulse Coronavirus Flash Survey from October 2020. So they're still very new. The survey was conducted between September 24 and October 9. And they basically tell a story that I'm sure is familiar to all of you. So there obviously has been a significant increase in remote working. And adding to that, organizations are beginning to plan a reduction in their office footprint. So basically that means more workers working from home. Some organizations are looking to implement a hybrid workplace, meaning you might be in the office a few days a week and stay home other days, alternating. Some employees might be full-time working from home. So we do see that organizations are looking to optimize their budgeting in different ways. One of them is in reducing the office footprint. Now, we have also monitored what their expectation is in terms of supporting a distributed workforce. You can see from the data on the screen that a majority of organizations believe that most of their employees should be able to work effectively remotely. One interesting trend here is that in the very first iteration of the survey, there was uncertainty in terms of how long the situation might last. The most recent iteration shows that organizations are now looking at this in the longer term. So that means they expect all of these altered conditions, meaning working remotely and a reduction in the office footprint, to remain. And given their timeline for planning and their spending cycles, they're already looking to make permanent changes. So this also includes, obviously, their requirements for team collaboration and team communications. Now, one thing to note here is that even though 69% of enterprises believe that a large number of their employees can be effective working remotely, this does not mean that they have solved all the challenges that this will entail. A majority still think that moving forward, supporting a distributed workforce will be a significant or at least a moderate challenge for them, and they are looking for ways in which they can address these challenges. Now, I would like to invite Anurag to share your thoughts in terms of the numbers that we're looking at here. What has been your experience? What are your clients telling you in terms of how they are dealing with the COVID-19 shutdown?
Great, Raul. Thanks for that, and thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. And as you mentioned, NetSfere as an organization has been viscerally focused in delivering robust messaging solutions to the enterprise. We provide platforms that enable agile collaboration, that are fully controllable by the enterprise, and fully encrypted as well. And so the perspective that I'll provide you will be from the standpoint of enterprises enabling their user base, especially during these unprecedented times. Now, organizations enterprises had already started a process of digitization. And as we came into the pandemic, which obviously was unprecedented, most organizations were prepared with some kind of a business continuity plan. And when they executed this plan, they fully realized that remote working was something that had to happen and had to happen quickly. And for that to be able to be effective, they had to enable and deliver the right solutions to their end users so that the end users at the end of the day could be productive. And within those solutions, messaging and collaboration became extremely important. Now, let me give you context on mobile messaging and the importance mobile messaging holds in everybody's lives. And this is based on data that we've seen. Over a period of time, mobile messaging has become the most singularly popular application on an end user's smart device. And the reason it is because mobile messaging itself allows an efficient means of communication in a brief manner that allows end users, especially in this environment where they're remote and they have to be productive and still have to be able to communicate effectively, allows them to, in an agile manner, communicate and get their job done. So mobile messaging continues to be extremely important. We've seen our customers leveraging mobile messaging more and more as a means to communicate. Companies that have taken a strong position around digitization, I believe, are better positioned and better prepared for this phenomena. And we believe the pandemic itself has created a catalyst effect, if you may, on the market, where people have had to accelerate their means to deploy solutions that catered to this space as well. So from our perspective, it has been a busy time for us, but it's also we have seen that companies that were better prepared with the right tools will be better positioned to be effective and remain productive moving forward, Raul.
Thank you. And you're making some interesting points there regarding the use of different modes of communications, and I want to get that later. But right now, let me just move on to the next slide because it is a good segue for some of the points that you were making. So one interesting thing about how we see that the pandemic has affected the workplace is that in many ways it is actually accelerating trends that we had already seen pre-pandemic. This includes a wide number of trends, not just related to communications and collaboration. For example, when it comes to digital transformation initiatives, we are seeing that even if organizations are faced with tighter budgets and there is uncertainty and maybe some projects have been on hold, one of the items that is definitely not on hold, and actually we are seeing organizations accelerate their efforts, is digital transformation. And interestingly, some of the initiatives that we had seen with what we call digital transformation leaders, and in our surveys, I should clarify that these are the organizations that already have a formal digital transformation strategy in place and are actively digitizing their business processes, technologies, and services, in contrast to what we identify as the laggards, which might be in the process of evaluating but do not have a formal strategy yet. Some of the trends that we were noticing with the digital transformation leaders pre-pandemic precisely were that those modes of messaging that you are describing. Certainly messaging was at the top. I could also mention mobility. So mobile first was a key component for how digital transformation leaders engage their teams. I could also mention flexible work arrangements. This is something that has been a trend for several years. And what's interesting is that even if we saw some of the more forward-looking companies start experimenting with these arrangements, with the pandemic, all of a sudden, everyone had to join them and enable remote work for a majority of their workers. So we feel that this is influencing and replicating what digital transformation leaders have been doing for several years. And now an adoption that we may have expected to last several years, all of a sudden was compressed into a very short period of time due to the conditions that the pandemic has imposed. So Anurag, in terms of the role that enterprise communications play, what are your thoughts in terms of agile collaboration and agile execution?
Yeah, thanks for that, Raul. So like you said, digital transformation of the enterprise had started for some time. And we had seen companies that were leading the effort who had recognized the need and the benefits of digitizing their enterprise. But there were also organizations who had not fully appreciated the benefits of a digital transformation. Now, clearly, the pandemic played a catalyst role in accelerating the efforts of not only the leaders, but of the entire enterprise space, because there was an immediate requirement for these enterprises to work remotely while remaining productive. And during the course of this digitization process that had started some time ago, enterprises had also appreciated the role of mobile messaging as it relates to what we are calling agile collaboration. So let's define agile collaboration for everybody so everybody understands what you're talking about, because this is a fairly new term. Agile collaboration in our context is the ability for an end user or at an enterprise to securely, contextually, and instantaneously collaborate with their peers within their organization and externally in order to be able to be productive and do their job. So this is a new way of communicating and a new way of engaging within the enterprise. Now, that being said, traditional communication platforms and the traditional UC platforms do not necessarily cater to this category of communication, which we are terming agile collaboration. And as I've always said, you know, modern problems cannot be solved by legacy solutions. And I position the UC platforms that were big and heavy to be legacy solutions that resolve a situation at the time that they were popular. But now, in order for agile collaboration to be implemented effectively within an enterprise, there is a need for a new set of solutions that takes into account the way end users want to work, the way they want to engage, and the way they want to communicate with one another. So that is a trend that we are seeing happen directly and impacts us immensely too, because we've seen a exponential increase in customers and users and messaging traffic over our platforms, which kind of validates everything that we've been saying in the past and what we're seeing today, Raul.
Thank you. And you're touching again on some topics that I want to expand on in about 2 slides. But right now, I just want to take a couple of those concepts that you are describing. And from my perspective, the bigger picture when it comes to agile collaboration, it's not just reflected in messaging. For example, we also saw, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this, the surging demand for video collaboration just as the pandemic was starting. And interestingly, the role of video in enterprise communications was something that we had been following for some time. And from our perspective, it was still in early stages of adoption, where even though it may have been available widely for most organizations, if you think about the typical unified communications platforms, they always have they tend to have integration to video communication and messaging for that matter. The usage, however, was very low for some enterprises, where we saw mainly the early adopters, that is digital native companies, high-tech companies, and so on, using it regularly. The same goes for messaging. And with this, I could like to look at some of the data points from the study that we did. This was a year ago, together with NetSfere, and just looking at some of the habits of the digital transformation leaders versus the laggards. So we talked about mobility, messaging, flexible work arrangements. Those were some of the trends that we were noticing with the digital transformation leaders. And as we mentioned earlier, this is something that now everyone has adopted. So in the case of this survey, and keep in mind this was pre-pandemic, we were noticing more and more organizations looking to allow flexible work hours or remote work. This was particularly relevant for employees aged 40 to 49, which could be Gen Xers. And this is largely related to the stage of their families, the age of their children. We also noticed that more companies were interested in looking at flexible work arrangements. And as we mentioned, all of a sudden this was mandatory for everyone with the pandemic. Now, the question that comes up here is, well, what kind of technology is the best one to support these work arrangements? So since we have been talking about the digital transformation leaders and trends that were already evident pre-pandemic, I think it's relevant then to look at what were these organizations doing to address their communications challenges, since that's the road they have already traveled, and what can we learn from these organizations. So let me jump to the next slide quickly, and then just share with you from a report that I published, and this was in December 2018, so this was a while ago. But basically what I was trying to understand is what kind of technologies specifically for communications and collaboration were relevant for a distributed work environment. And as we mentioned, now everyone is in a distributed work environment. So there were basically 4 attributes or categories that we identified. So first of all, access from anywhere, anytime. And this basically translates into the virtues of mobile communications and cloud-based collaboration to provide employees with access to business applications, content, regardless of the location, device, or network they choose to use. So obviously this encompasses mobile workers, frontline workers, remote workers, and it's a setting that is what we are living through right now. Now, another attribute that we identify is the need for workflow-defined communications, meaning a tight integration with business workflows and business applications. The way we look at this is communications cannot be isolated from the rest of the organization's business applications, but rather they should be present in a supporting way. So we see less traffic in terms of isolated tools and more towards those tools that can be easily integrated into business workflows. And for many employees, that translates into mobility or mobile first. And we will get into this, we will expand on this in the next slides. But let me just touch on the other two attributes, which is intelligent communications. And this is something that we have been also hearing about for several years. The use of artificial intelligence in the form of machine learning and natural language understanding to enable organizations to orchestrate interactions between employees and customers in real time. Now, keep in mind that the framework that we are looking at is very broad. So this will encompass all types of communications, internal, external, the role of unified communications, contact center, messaging, team collaboration tools. And we also included other tools such as intranet. And then finally, secure and compliant. So obviously, we're talking about the accessibility from anywhere, anytime. IT will require that communications be secure and compliant in order to enable a wide range of use cases. So we talked about mobile workers, remote workers, and frontline workers, which are actually a very interesting subset of workers, typically not included in the traditional business communication tools. So you don't see a contact center for frontline workers, for example, or you don't see unified communications for frontline workers. With some exceptions, I will say that some more forward-looking unified communications vendors are looking at this, but they're actually a minority. So one way we have seen business communications evolve is there has been a strong emphasis from traditional communications in terms of accessibility. So for example, many unified communications providers now include standard mobility features. There has also been an increased emphasis on workflow integration. Where we see the opportunity, however, is in the use of AI, which is still evolving in terms of the role that it will play for communications and collaboration. And the last one, which from our perspective is very relevant, we had seen limited use, for example, of encryption. And that is a question that I have for Anurag, because even though everyone agrees that security is important, but until now we have not really seen secure encrypted communications play an important or a relevant role when the conversation about enterprise communications comes up. So what are your thoughts on why this is happening, Anurag?
Right. So, Raul, so let me start by just talking about a comment you made around video, and I'll frame that into the question that we talked about encryption as well. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said video has been around for a while, but it was not effectively leveraged by the enterprise, because my belief is it was because of the way video was presented to the enterprise end user. It was always presented in a very heavy manner, And what end users were really looking for was the means to be able to instantaneously, contextually engage with video simply so as to be able to effectively do their job on a day-to-day basis. Now, we saw during the pandemic solutions come out that allowed end users to do some of that. And again, it leads into our recognition of agile collaboration as a very, very important realm in this current environment. It was always there, but it has now become that much more important. Now, the survey that we did with 451 Research a little while ago was really our means to understand what we always had believed. We believed that agile collaboration helped increase enterprise productivity, but we didn't have a quantifiable means to kind of establish that. And so what that survey actually allowed us to establish very effectively was quantify what that productivity increase was and how it impacted an enterprise. So we found an interesting data point, Raul, which you are familiar with, which was effectively that organizations that were digitizing and had recognized the need for an agile collaboration platform, including messaging, effectively saw a productivity gain that ranged from anywhere from 10 to 20%, which, if you actually do the math, is a huge number, which effectively makes a solution such as ours a no-brainer from a deployment perspective. So it goes from a nice-to-have to a must-have, especially in today's environment. Now, you look at the distributed work environment that you described, it is right on the money because that's the way we perceive the environment that we deliver solutions to. So our NetSfere platform has been developed as a mobile-first platform that's very simplistic, easy to deploy, accessible from anywhere. It is packaged in a manner to deliver workflow-defined communications, or the ability to communicate in a contextual manner around your workflow. We built in a artificial intelligence, natural language engine into the platform so that the platform becomes that much more effective in their environment. And finally, as you mentioned, security in the context of encryption. We felt encryption was going to be hugely important, and we wanted to make sure encryption across the board at a device level, over the network, and at rest was available as a necessity, so as a standard. It was not something that was turned on or off. It was there regardless. And we gave the keys of that to the enterprise so that there's complete control at all times within the enterprise. So I believe to be an enterprise-grade agile collaboration platform, encryption and security is not optional. It's not something that gets turned on and off. The keys of that encryption have to be within the enterprise, and that's essentially how we deliver our platform as well, Raul.
Thank you. So we are expanding on the topic of encryption further on. Right now, let me move on to some other data points to frame that conversation. This is from our Voice of the Customer Corporate IT Spending Survey. And again, these are numbers that I'm sure will not be a surprise for the participants in this webinar. But basically what you see is a dramatic downturn in IT spending when the pandemic hit. Now, especially compared to previous years where there was a steady increase, there was a sudden downturn. This is a survey that was completed in May 2020, but it tracks forward-looking actions on a quarterly basis. So the expectation for this quarter is that there could be a dramatic downturn. Now, what's relevant about this is that there are 10 categories that our survey tracks in enterprise software. There was just one category that was the exception and actually showed an uptick in terms of IT spending, and that is collaboration, communications and collaboration. Now, there are some interesting aspects to this. One is mainly in the initial days of the COVID-19 shutdown, as organizations were scrambling to address the requirements of supporting a distributed workforce, the number one concern for them was ensuring business continuity, and with this, business communications and collaboration was their number one priority. So even though they were holding back on other expenses, communications and collaboration remained the top priority. Now, let me show you what the other priorities were. So in addition to employee communications and collaboration, you had information security and adding bandwidth network capacity. Now, obviously, all of these are related to supporting a distributed workforce and the different challenges that come with it. And one of the ways in which we look at these and other data points from a survey are what are the challenges that still remain and that organizations are struggling with that still need some help with. So as you can see from the top down, secure communications remains a problem. One other relevant aspect to these data points that I want to highlight is that they are forward-looking. So this survey, as I mentioned, was conducted in May, forward-looking to the next quarters, and we just completed another one that we're still sifting through the information. But we are seeing that organizations are now moving beyond that initial response and looking towards the longer term. In other words, what are the technologies that will support the work arrangements that they contemplate for the next 2 years and forward. And this includes certainly continued support for a distributed workforce, and this obviously at the top is secure communications and collaboration. So with these numbers in mind, Anurag, what are your thoughts in terms of the key challenges that organizations are facing for supporting a distributed workforce?
So Raul, these numbers actually are in line with what we are seeing as well from our perspective, because as I mentioned to you, we've seen a tremendous increase in our user base as well as our customer base based on trends that you highlighted here, which are kind of validated by your survey. Means clearly collaboration is very, very important, especially in the context today. But we've also seen an interesting trend where there's certain verticals that had actually moved much more aggressively than others. We saw a huge uptake from the healthcare industry, and to kind of help facilitate the healthcare industry and do our part during the pandemic, we actually made our platform available free of charge to any healthcare organization that required it in order to be able to do their job more effectively. So we have been supporting that effort. We also saw other organizations that belong to verticals that had compliance requirements move very aggressively into this space, because not only did they have to keep their workforce productive, but compliance was something that became that much more important in the context of an entirely remote workforce. So how do you keep them compliant based on message retention or information retention mandates that their verticals had. So finance and legal were also areas that were extremely important to us, and we saw a considerable amount of uptake. Now, the challenges for an enterprise as they go, and this is across the board without mentioning the verticals that we just talked about, challenges remain the same. In order to be able to equip a distributed workforce, enterprises have to firstly acknowledge that there remains a need where end users are looking to collaborate and to communicate very effectively by leveraging tools and means that are other than what they have traditionally been provided. And by that I mean, I'll just touch upon the advent of and the popularity of a platform like WhatsApp. And we see WhatsApp kind of filter its way into the enterprise and essentially compromise the enterprise because WhatsApp as a platform was never ever built for the enterprise, never enterprise grade. And we see many such examples of OTT apps kind of encroach into the enterprise. So the reason they're encroaching is consumers are bringing their consumer apps into the enterprise because the enterprise is effectively not providing them the solutions they need. So in order to do that, the enterprise have to acknowledge that end users have kind of voted their preference and said mobile messaging is a means of communication that works for us. It's instantaneous. It provides an instantaneous response. I think data is available that says a mobile message is typically responded to within 15 minutes of it being received, which is a much more higher response rate than a traditional email. It's light. The brevity of a mobile message allows them to communicate much more effectively. So let's acknowledge the fact that there has to be a mobile messaging-based solution deployed that also gives access to some of the agile collaboration tools and features required. So we believe the environment needs to ensure that whatever is deployed is first and foremost caters to the requirements of the end users, is mobile first and mobile friendly because that's where most of the communication is originating, is entirely controllable by the IT organization so they can mandate use and also ensure that information is being effectively protected. And finally, and most importantly, the platform has to be secure and encrypted. It cannot be an option. It cannot be a choice. It has to be secure and encrypted. So if you check mark all of those areas, you can effectively deploy and make available a good enterprise deployment of agile collaboration, Raul.
Thank you. So let me take some of those points and get to the next slide. One issue that came up, this data is from our information security survey that was done from June 2 to July 20. And obviously the survey covers many other areas, but specifically when it comes to communications and security, you can see that secure collaboration still remains a top concern for IT decision makers. And this actually, obviously security was already a concern for them, but it became even more urgent with employees working from home and having to rely on different tools for communication and collaboration. Now, one question that I want to tackle with you is you mentioned healthcare, for example. We saw something similar in the case of in the financial industry with those employees that support high-value accounts and typically are out of an office rather than working remotely. So we definitely see the need for secure collaboration with those employees. But with the broader view, outside of healthcare, finance, and other regulated verticals, why do you think IT should be concerned with encrypted communications for all workers?
So in the verticals that you described, finance and healthcare, these are regulated verticals, right? So they have a regulatory mandate to to ensure that information is kept secure because they're managing and maintaining information from a range of sources, right? So it's a no-brainer, and the need for secure communications or encrypted communications is recognized. Now, this actually spreads itself across the board because all organizations that are in a business are essentially conducting business remotely, and when conducting business remotely, they have and tend to exchange intellectual information that is proprietary to their organization, whether regulated or not. Now, if that is the case, and they want to make sure that that information is not compromised in today's environment, which is an accelerated cybersecurity risk environment, then they have to ensure that the platform they're using to collaborate and communicate is essentially secure. And the only way we believe it can be secure is through a level of encryption. So this is no longer just the realm of regulated entities. We've also seen the advent of regulations that touch all organizations that maintain some access to end user data, meaning GDPR. Even though GDPR is a European standard, any company based anywhere doing any business of any kind with a European entity will have to ensure that the information that they're sharing and exchanging and storing is encrypted and secure. So this need has gone from being a specialized need for regulated industries that were trying to stay in compliance with their regulatory obligations to something that has become horizontal around, where the need has encroached across the board, where the pandemic has come across as the catalyst in forcing that issue. So where I see the data that you just presented, where the somewhat concerned folks are 52% of the top IT decision makers, I would actually tell them, don't be somewhat concerned, be very concerned. Because the new normal of working remotely and collaborating remotely makes this an issue that has to be on your front page and has to be addressed right away.
Thank you. So that is one issue that I want to expand a little bit with you. So one of the challenges that we see right now in our interactions with enterprises is that right now the landscape for enterprise communications and collaboration is very complex and fragmented. So we see this in different ways. There have been many messaging companies entering the market. We actually noticed a spike around 2010, and then many of them exiting. We noticed some of them were either acquired or in other cases they focus on specific verticals, for example. So there is a smaller number of vendors. Some of the acquisitions were by unified communications providers. Early on, RingCentral, and then later Google, Microsoft. So this does, I think, on one hand, make your point about the relevance of messaging for enterprise communications. However, one of the questions that we come across often is that if unified communications is already offering video and messaging, and we also have specialized communications, for example, many times IT or DevOps, they tend to have their own preference for different tools. And then we also mentioned that in the case of frontline workers, they also tend to have their own tools. On top of that, one thing that does keep coming up in our survey, and you mentioned it earlier, many employees are still using over-the-top applications like WhatsApp or their own SMS. So this presents a rather complex landscape for IT decision makers. So what could be your recommendation here?
So again, I think what you have framed is effectively true. And without commenting on other companies, I will tell you, and you know this, that we at NetSfere have been viscerally focused on developing a messaging-based agile collaboration platform that encompasses within a messaging framework everything from voice, video, to other collaboration capabilities, right? And we've stayed pure to this and true to this purpose right from the start. The reason we're seeing the advent of companies like Microsoft in this space, and Microsoft actually is a relatively newer entrant in this space, and they entered into this space because they recognized the need and also recognized that the market existed, because it was basically a propagation of what we had been saying for some time. So we actually are excited about the fact that we have a lot of these larger companies come into this space and get validation from the market, because it validates not only what we have been saying, but also the space that we belong to. That being said, our approach to the solution is very different. And our approach has always been that we have to deliver a range of capability within the messaging surround. This is the messaging surround that end users have acknowledged because of their usage preference that they have voted towards multiple times, more importantly, by leveraging consumer-based OTT messaging platforms like WhatsApp and others. And if we are not able to provide them with that solution, guess what? Any other heavy UC-based solution that may be focused only on video, does video really well but does not do other things, forces the users to continue to stay outside of the realm, continue to use consumer-based applications, and effectively continue to compromise the enterprise. So my feedback, or at least counsel, to IT decision makers when they are looking at this situation is, firstly, recognize the problem. A problem exists, and that messaging problem cannot be solved by a heavy UC-based platform that is expensive, not easy to use, caters to a single vertical capability like video, for instance, but does not provide all the user functionality that the end user requires. So recognize the issue and also acknowledge the fact that an enterprise solution has to be deployed. Then once you recognize the solution, then it's easy to take a look at the solutions out there and make an assessment. I would counsel them to take a look and make sure that the solution they look at is firstly mobile first, because that's where end users are originating most, if not all, their communication. Everybody is coming to us from a mobile device. A solution that was built for a PC platform that is trying to port itself over to the mobile environment is not going to go. So mobile first is essential in picking the right solution. Second, it should provide you the contextual, workflow-based means of communicating instantaneously. Check and see if it does that within the realm of messaging, because that is something end users are talking for and asking for considerably. Make sure it has the means to integrate within their full workflow to a certain extent, but do that in a secure manner. It has to be extremely secure. We believe it essentially has to be encrypted. Encryption can't be an option. It can't be turned on and off. It has to be there, period. And finally, we believe that whatever platform they pick, it has to be entirely controllable by the IT organization, because that's the only way an enterprise can assure that the mandate they're making for end users to use this platform is in play, and that mandate allows them to protect the enterprise while keeping their end users productive. So again, to break it down, mobile first, has to be contextual, instantaneous communications, has to be workflow defined, has to be secure, encrypted, and entirely controllable by the IT organization.
Thank you. That's a really relevant point, and we're getting to the end of the webinar, so let me just make one quick point. One thing that we have noticed with this transition to remote work, and again, another trend that we had seen emerging, was the mobile-first communications. So that became kind of a buzzword for a little while when many vendors were touting their mobility features. But we did notice that from the side of organizations, mobile first became very relevant, not just because they were noticing the low usage of mobile features in some of their communications, and in some cases, and we did this with some surveys, but to give you an idea, typically for unified communications, and this was pre-pandemic, I should point out, the usage of mobile applications for UC was around 30%, which is very, very low. It was more common for employees, even if they were sitting at their own desks in their offices, to reach out for their mobile phone rather than their desk phone. So I think that's something very relevant that you are pointing out. And then finally, before I hand it over to Christine, any last thoughts regarding encrypted communications, Anurag?
Yeah, so I think it's really important for the enterprise, like I said, throughout this webinar, to recognize the problem. This is not something we can run from. This is real. Otherwise, end users will find a way to get alternate solutions, thereby compromising the enterprise. So that is extremely important for them to recognize it. Second, when it comes to security and encryption, there can be no compromise. There can't be an environment where encryption can be turned on and turned off. There can absolutely not be a situation where we go down a solution that remains silent on encryption. And there cannot be a situation where encryption is thrown in as an afterthought or it's bolted on, saying, oops, we forgot encryption. Guess what? We need to put it in now, and we're going to do our best to make that happen. You have to look at solutions that are best of breed, that have been built on a pillar that revolves around encryption, and that encryption has to extend starting from the device. Because we talked about how important the mobile device is, that encryption has to extend from the device to the transport layer as information is being transported from point A to point B within the enterprise. And that encryption has to extend to information that's at rest within the cloud or within the servers to ensure complete end-to-end compliance and end-to-end security for the enterprise. Anything less than that essentially compromises the organization, puts it at greater risk, especially in today's pandemic environment where cybersecurity risks have increased exponentially. And you cannot afford to have your information sitting around on an unprotected device, on an unprotected network, and unprotected either on the cloud or at rest within your service. So look at this aspect of your solution very, very carefully. And also, finally, recognize that Agile Collaboration is here to stay. It's new. It's new because it provides instantaneous, contextual means to collaborate and communicate that directly impacts productivity. It's new because end users are demanding it. It's new because the workforce is changing. And as it changes, new solutions require, new products. And that's why we are excited about this space that we belong to, Raul, in the context of agile communication and collaboration. Back to you.
Thank you, Anurag. So we're running out of time. I just want to do a quick reminder. The slides are available for download as well as a report with more details on the different surveys and data points that we are sharing here. So everyone that is participating in this webinar can access that. And with this, I would like to thank everyone and hand it over to Christine.
Great. Thank you so much, Raul and Anurag. That does conclude our webinar for today. And as another quick reminder, the on-demand version of this event will be available shortly. So on behalf of NetSfere and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.